Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, will the normalization of ties between Israel and Bahrain, as well as Israel and the United Arab Emirates, respectively, be enough to carry Benjamin Netanyahu's political career forward? Because, as we know, he is facing a number of corruption trials, and now, of course, a lot of criticism over his handling or mishandling, if we put it that way, of the coronavirus pandemic as well. There have been, for a while now, a protest movement growing across, that region, in front of his house, in front of certain important areas in that region, again, against Netanyahu and his policies, as well as also his party as well. So within Israel proper, there seems to be this movement against Netanyahu, but of course on the international stage, he has gotten these quote-unquote victories. So how does then one understand the impact of both of these sort of opposing realities on his political career at this time? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Azriel Bermant, who is a lecturer in international relations at Hebrew University. He's also the author of Margaret Thatcher and the Middle East. He's joining us today from Jerusalem. Also joining us from Jerusalem is Abbey, who is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Alan and Azriel, thank you both for your time today. Alan, let me start with you, if I may. As I said, there are two seemingly different realities, right? On the foreign policy front, I would imagine that for Israelis as well, what's happened with Bahrain and the UAE have been wins. But then how does then one see that with coronavirus and the mishandling of that, as well as Netanyahu's trials and corruption charges?
Well, that's a good question, of course. Look, Israelis are happy that there has been normalization agreements with two countries in the two countries in the Persian Gulf. It's important for Israel to expand its connections. At the same time, I think, however, most Israelis are more concerned about domestic issues. It's not just the coronavirus, of course, which has caused a lot of sadness and a lot of death, but also the economic impact and the way the government has mishandled it. So if you were to put a list of the top 5 issues of the day, I don't think, frankly, the normalization agreements would be in that top 5.
Azriel, I wonder if you agree with that, because, again, as I said, on the international stage, these would be for Israel itself an important win for it. But nevertheless, is that enough to provide cover for Netanyahu on these many, many other issues?
I agree with what Alan just said. I think that right now Israel is in such severe crisis, both with regard to the coronavirus, the intensity of the virus, the spread of the virus, also the awful domestic situation, the severe lockdown that has been imposed, the rise in unemployment. The situation domestically is so bleak that I think there's very little appetite or interest right now in, or at least relatively, in these normalization agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain.
Alan, what are your thoughts about the fact that we're going into a lockdown again, right, in that region? So there's been talk, as I'm sure you've heard of, Alan, that this is a way for Netanyahu to suppress, in fact, this protest movement against him. Is that a fair assessment?
It may not have been his single intent. I think we do need a lockdown, unfortunately, because the amount of coronavirus has reached alarming heights in Israel, and nothing else has seemed to slow it down. However, this is a political lockdown as much as anything, partly because of the internal political issues Netanyahu has had to deal with, the ultra-Orthodox who are flouting these laws and these efforts, and are bringing a lot of health problems to the entire country. But it certainly benefits Netanyahu not to have protests in front of his house in Caesarea and in front of his offices in Jerusalem. So I don't think it was his primary goal, although there are probably people who think that. However, as a side effect, it's one of those things that probably makes him rest a little easier at night.
Azriel, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there's more politics at play here, or that there's equal amount of politics as well as genuine concern about public health when it comes to this lockdown?
I think I disagree with Alan, because I do. The behavior of Netanyahu and his ministers during this crisis suggests that this really is an opportunity that is being exploited to shut down protests. The fact that that Netanyahu is constantly harping on about these protests, everything that he's saying, all his rhetoric, the statements of his ministers on this issue, all that they seem to talk about the whole time is the protests. They are giving the clear impression that this is being used to suppress, to stifle protests. To be sure, it has been necessary to impose restrictions because of the spread of the coronavirus. The fact that you now have well over 1,500 people have died in Israel of coronavirus. Clearly, there is a need for restrictions, but at the same time, Netanyahu's conduct gives rise to a strong sense that it is being used. The crisis is being used to stifle democratic protest.
All right, Alan, I'm going to refer to the elephant in the room. That's how the Palestinians are suffering, or whatever term we want to use, are going through this pandemic as well as anybody else, of course, around the world. But then especially as people who are quote unquote under occupation by Israel, do you think that there is right now a good enough relationship, let me put it that way, between the Israeli authorities and the Palestinian authorities in dealing with the pandemic? Because I would imagine that Israel understands very well, as do the Palestinians, that this really is a situation where they need to work together for the benefit of both sides. Because if one side still has it, I mean, they're living in such close quarters that it would be impossible to prevent then any outbreak both ways.
Absolutely. The Palestinians throughout the authority are suffering from economic disruptions as well as the pandemic problems. And it was recently said, however, by Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, that they would cease all cooperation with Israel as a result of the Bahrain and UAE agreements. I somehow doubt, frankly, that has really taken place. There is ongoing security agreement in terms of health care. I would certainly hope that both sides would be able to work together. You mentioned correctly, of course, that Israel and Palestine are not just side by side, but somewhat intertwined. And what affects, when we get a cold, they sneeze. When they get a cold, we sneeze. So it is problematic if the two sides are not working together. However, in fact, there have been very few contacts and positive signs, at least officially and above the table, from the Palestinian Authority on this. If you read anything that has been said by Saeb Erekat and others, they just have no interest in talking to Israel at this time.
And it's understandable, isn't it, Azriel? Because obviously the normalization with Bahrain and the UAE for the Palestinians was seen as a betrayal. And of course, we can debate that till there is no tomorrow. But nevertheless, that is their point of view, and that's the point of view of many Palestinians. But nevertheless, I would think, and one would hope, that this would be given priority, right? Because as I put to Alan, this affects everybody in equal measure if there is, God forbid, a major outbreak.
Certainly, during this COVID-19 pandemic, the Palestinians have an interest in making sure they're working with Israel. But at the same time, of course, there is a strong anger within the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian population, about the fact that the sense that the Gulf states signed these agreements with that Bahrain, the UAE, turned their back on the Palestinians, and after all, for decades, the received wisdom has been that these states would not sign any agreement with Israel before the Palestinian question is resolved, or at least that there's made major progress towards a resolution of this problem. So there is a strong sense of anger with UAE and Bahrain, and of course other states that may be on the way to signing agreements, that they are abandoning the Palestinians. So it is not surprising that the Palestinian leadership right now is making a fuss on this issue, feels very aggrieved on this issue.
Alan, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. Do you think this is the time that you mentioned that the Palestinians have taken a step back and have said that they will not be cooperating with the Israeli authorities when it comes to security and other such important factors, which they have for these many years. Do you think it's time for possibly the Israelis then to reach out and say, listen, we are in this together genuinely? And I mean, I'm not saying that, this is a very optimistic view, but this may very well be the first step towards showing signs or light at the end of the tunnel of possibility and hopes of direct peace talks between these two sides once again.
Sure, crisis can bring out the best in people. I hope that it does. Just today or just yesterday, we heard that Israel and Lebanon are actually speaking about natural gas reserves in the Mediterranean. However, it is good to know that some conversations like this can occur when there are mutual interests at stake. And so I would hope, of course, that there is an opportunity. Unfortunately, the Israeli government is almost as dysfunctional at the moment as the Palestinian Authority government, and I wish that weren't the case, but I think both are so caught up in some of their internal issues, Israel particularly. I can speak more authoritatively on that than the Palestinians, but clearly both sides are struggling internally, and it would be great if that would happen. I would hope that would happen, but those kinds of overtures are often taken when a country feels strong and its leadership feels solid. Unfortunately, I don't see Netanyahu feeling so strong and solid in that respect now. So I doubt if he's going to be willing, capable politically even of making that overture, not to speak of the weakness in the Palestinian Authority as well. So my hope would be that there would be cooperation. I don't expect it, but we always have hope.
Very well. We'll leave final word, but we appreciate both Azriel and Alan for putting all of this into context for us, for telling us the reality on the ground there. Certainly, yes, as both of our guests there alluded to, the priorities for Israelis right now are the situation within the region itself at this point in time, vis-a-vis the coronavirus, vis-a-vis mishandling of that virus. And we can probably also add on, the economic crisis, which the entire world really is going through at this point in time because of the pandemic and the virus. But then also Netanyahu's corruption trials have not helped his image. But the elephant in the room, for me at least, and for many others around the world, will always remain the Palestinian issue and, the dealings with the Palestinians, even over just this pandemic, and also just, over Netanyahu and how he's acted towards the Palestinians, his legacy towards the Palestinians altogether. I mean, I read a recent article in Jerusalem Post by somebody who negotiated previous accords, the Oslo Accords, I believe, and has been involved in negotiations with Palestinians ever since, also about how Netanyahu has not been able to and has failed when it comes, in fact, to the Palestinian issue as well, in trying to come to, of course, a peaceful resolution for both sides. And then that is just as important a factor as his mishandling of the pandemic and, of course, other issues that may be connected to that. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss now Germany and the AfD party there, which has fired its former spokesman, who was caught on video essentially calling for the possible shooting and gassing of migrants if need be, which is, of course, an extreme view, extremely disturbing view for many, many reasons. But, of course, that sort of very anti-migrant view to be expressed in that fashion, at this point in time where we know that there is a major migrant crisis, especially in the countries like Greece and others, which are grappling with also then the reality of the pandemic at this point. Even though, of course, the numbers that are arriving in Europe in context to other areas in the world are actually significantly lower than other areas. I mean, here in Pakistan, we've been hosting refugees in many, many exponentially higher numbers, I should say, in fact, than Europe has at this point in time. Nevertheless, as this quote-unquote invasion is being called by UK politicians as well, Germany is also not a stranger to this issue of migrants and the negative connotations that brings to their presence in the country, and them seeking safety from persecution around the world as well. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Jürgen, who is a professor of political science at Martin Luther University in Halle. He's joining us now from Neuss in Cologne. Jürgen, thank you very much for your time today. What do you make of the statements of this AfD spokesman, previous spokesman, of course? It's really disturbing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is incredible. It is unbelievable that someone in Germany could utter such a point of view. It is essential that someone who holds such positions is dismissed and has no position in public at all. So the reaction of his former party was absolutely necessary. There is no other person whom I know who would dare to say something like this in parliament or in public anywhere.
But then, I would imagine that this did not happen in a vacuum, right? I mean, I would, as disturbing as this certainly is, even in the context of Germany, there's a reason why he felt comfortable enough to even say this. Does this mean that there are people who think this way at this time?
First, this word was uttered in a private conversation. I do not know what other people who pass by in the street may think. So in private, in bed, whatsoever, in a family atmosphere, what people might say there is unknown to the public, and rightly so. But there is a minority within that right-wing party which holds extremist ideas. That person, Lüth, called himself a fascist. That is a minority even in that small party, which is around 9% in public polls in this month.
So do you think that that most Germans want to take in more migrants? Because as you know, Jürgen, the issue right now is that in Moria camp, for example, or previously in Moria camp in Greece, there were all those migrants, and then there was that fire, and then the pandemic. There's many issues facing these migrants and asylum seekers, and Germany is trying to take in more, especially children. Do you think that this will work? Do you think that Germans agree with their government when it comes to this policy?
There has been no opposition to the position of the present German government in this area. We are willing, the Germans are willing to help immediately if it is necessary, as it is the case in Moria at present now. But there are thoughts what might happen if millions or tens of millions of people from Africa might move to Europe with the destination of Germany. It is well known that countries right or left from a war area are much more affected by migrants than Europe. That's clear, as you said. But there is a wish of millions of Africans to have a better life. This is understandable, but if millions would come, if they came to Germany, then our society would be changed totally. And this is something which might cause fear among some people.
I wanted to add voice to this conversation. We're now also joined by Klaus, Jurgens, who is a political analyst and journalist. He's joining us currently from Innsbruck in Austria. Klaus, as always, we appreciate you taking your time out to join us. What are your thoughts, about what the spokesman said about, gassing or shooting migrants, and just overall the view on the issue of the migrant and refugee crisis in Germany?
Well, hello. Thanks for having me. As always, a pleasure. Well, the comments by Lüth, of course, date back quite some time now. And it was not the first such incident only now. He did single out migrants in particular. He had already troubles with his own party. He was actually suspended previously from his spokesperson. He had two, one for the party, one for the faction in the Bundestag, the national parliament. Then he actually got completely fired. Some in the party wanted to have him back, but this was immediately cancelled. Now, I was completely shocked. I think this is too low for zero, even for a far-right party like the AfD. Now, why did he say it? And you know the story. There was a secret tape or then a public-made tape by a private TV station, and all taken together, I think it sheds the light on something much wider. Is this just a single isolated incident, or is there a kind of undercurrent in this party? Not only one person thinking this ludicrously heinous thoughts, and in particular me as a German, absolutely shell-shocked. Now, this is the one point. The second point, if I may, very brief,
sure.
The AfD, Alternative for Germany, has to come to terms. Are they going to be a mainstream party, or will they disappear as a far-right fringe group like others before them? There was a very interesting debate on German TV only a few days ago. Another leading member tried to defend his party, talking about issues, and he actually said, I fully appreciate the final sacking of Herr Lüth. Now, there is a kind of fight going on in the AfD. Let's see who wins if they want to have a chance for survival.
Yeah. I'll give you the fight, in fact, Klaus, before I let both of you go. You know, there is concern, isn't there, Klaus, overall in Germany about far right and, you know, the influence of the far right even on police. You know, there's been a lot of talk recently in German media about, you know, in chat groups, how some police members, of course, not all, have you know, used some very far right terms and negative racist terms as well towards minorities and others. And then there's even concerns about military members doing the same also in certain regards. Is this a concern? Will the government be able to deal with this properly?
I hope so. The only positive thing which comes out of this is that now it is in the open and no longer swept under the carpet, as we would say. Yes, there were cases in the police force, cases in the military, in particular just across the border from here in Baden-Württemberg. The land minister-president, he said himself, we will set up a kind of clearinghouse, a complaint center to investigate each and every of these allegations. If they are found true, we will take immediate action. Racism has no place in the police force. Sadly, as it did happen, but as I said, it is now out in the open and can be properly dealt with.
Very well. Leave it there at that, but we do sincerely appreciate both Klaus and Jürgen for their time today and, of course, their insight, right? This issue, as I put to both of our guests, is one that is growing in Germany. I mean, I've done a number of shows on the far right within Germany, concerns within the ranks of police, military, politicians, of course, even as we've seen now within the AfD party. And the AfD party, to begin with, has had troubling views on minorities and has racist rhetoric sometimes within its ranks. But this was really a step too far, talking about the gassing and shooting of migrants, especially with the historical context that we have within Germany. I mean, it's unfathomable that somebody would think that that would be an appropriate, action to even speak of towards any human being anywhere in the world, but especially in the context of Germany. Even if it's a private event, as Jürgen there correctly pointed out, of course, the fact that this gentleman felt confident enough to be able to say that, even in a private event, it just defies logic, and it's beyond understanding of any sort. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a pro-militant group, a pro-Trump militant group. But before that, of course, we should mention the elephant in the room. As of this recording, we know that Donald Trump, as well as Melania Trump, the First Lady as well of the United States, do have coronavirus. And of course, we wish them well. But nevertheless, it feels still appropriate to discuss what may very well happen with these elections coming forward, because we do have militant groups, and we have had a number of such quote-unquote groups with violent leanings that do support Donald Trump at this time, be it for the election or be it for his policies, be it against the Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen throughout the United States and, in fact, throughout the world as well. How much of a danger do these groups pose at this point in time to opposing sides, and are there left-wing militant groups too? I mean, that's also a concern which keeps coming up, especially on the part of Donald Trump when he keeps mentioning Antifa, as we well know, as he did in this latest debate with Joe Biden also. So let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Maria Isabel, who is an adjunct professor of political science and sociology at Valencia College and Ana G. Mendez University. She's joining us currently from Orlando, Florida. Joining us from New Haven, Connecticut is Dr. Jeffrey Treistman, who is an assistant professor of national security graduate coordinator as well at the University of New Haven. Jeffrey and Maria, good morning to you both, and thank you for your time today. Jeffrey, let me start with you. About this specific group, and there are a number of them, right? So there's the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys. I mean, there is a bit of an endless list on the number of groups you can possibly target and talk about. But how much of a concern should this be, or do you think it's being overstated?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to consider is that right-wing terrorism in the United States is nothing new. In fact, one of the oldest terrorist organizations in the United States is, in fact, arguably a right-wing group, the Ku Klux Klan, and racially motivated organization. And then, of course, in the United States, we have a long history of right-wing extremism, especially in the 1990s. We have to recall the Ruby Ridge incident in 1992, Waco in 1993, and, of course, most infamously, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, all perpetrated by right-wing extremist groups. But to your question, yes, today right-wing extremism is extremely broad. It's very difficult to categorize, and whether or not it actually satisfies our definition of terrorism is another entirely different issue. But largely speaking, there are three broad categories of right-wing extremism in the United States today. First, we do have those groups that are racially motivated, those who are white supremacists. Second, I would say that we have groups that are affiliated, that are identified as anti-federalists. These are patriot and militia groups. And then the third kind of bin or category we could say that we have in terms of right-wing extremism today is these fundamentalist protesters or individuals associated with the Christian identity, anti-abortion activists or anti-homosexual activists as well. Yeah. And so, these groups clearly pose a significant national security threat in the United States today. Let me be clear, of course, these are not the only domestic terrorist groups we have. As you alluded to, there is a very active left-wing terrorist element in the United States as well, and it equally has a long history in this country, as it does, of course, in many parts of the world, including Europe. But left-wing terrorism is still alive and well. But I would definitely say that right-wing extremism to this day is currently the most deadly and most alarming from a national security perspective. Certainly, the FBI director has testified publicly several times over the past couple of years to this effect as well.
Maria, what are your thoughts on this? Because as Jeffrey there just mentioned, of course, we've had officials over the years, especially intelligence officials, warn over and over again about the threat that these groups pose to the national security of the United States. Has that threat been taken seriously enough? And in some ways, do you think a president like Trump or even other officials have almost played into their hands and almost encouraged them in some ways?
Well, there are two things I would like I agree. There are different groups because of their goals and their ideological inspiration. But there's also an embedded cultural factor. And I guess that not just Trump, not just during his administration, we could go back to this sort of unease with the changes in the demographics of the country that, of course, have given these groups that while they are different in their approach to the issue, they might be under the umbrella of the use of violence. Now, regarding what this administration has done to probably give them some sort of comfort and give them space to come from the underground, because like the other guest has said, this is not new. This has been pretty much, I lived in Texas in a time where the Ku Klux Klan was very much alive. And I'm currently in Florida, and we have a lot of groups that are still active. What I think is that this particular administration not just President Trump, I'm referring to the narrative of this government, has given them some sort of comfort to join in publicly. Now, what should give us some perspective is that it is this administration's FBI and other members of the intelligence community who have sent warnings about these groups and what they're doing. So this is something that I think should be valued in terms of institutional response to this threat.
Indeed. Jeffrey, there are a lot of doomsday scenarios that people are talking about, right? So I wonder what you make of that, because with the elections coming up, we've already had, on both sides in some ways or the other, I mean, we've had Donald Trump saying he may or may not accept the results. I know there's a lot of debate about what he meant when he said that at the time. And then we've also had on the Democrat side, Hillary Clinton telling Biden not to concede too quickly, essentially, is what I gather from that in her paraphrasing. But do you think that we are in some ways heading to some sort of a quote-unquote civil war, as even in this Atlantic article, when it spoke about the Oath Keepers, it said that they are preparing essentially for a civil war?
It's an excellent, challenging question. On the one hand, as somebody who spent decades studying insurgencies and civil wars and terrorism, I can tell you that in many respects, it is a bit sensationalist. It is a bit overblown. And I think it discounts the strength of the United States, the strength of the American people. On the other hand, these groups are openly calling for civil war. And again, it's nothing new. We have what was called the Turner Diaries that openly called for the overthrow of the United States and promote a racial war. We have groups that are basing their names essentially on the second civil war, in particular the Boogaloo movement. We have racial groups in the United States. The Base in particular is a group seeking the collapse of the United States in support of creating a white state. So these groups are openly calling for, and keep in mind, the president himself, certainly amidst the impeachment process last year, tweeted and alluded to the fact that removal of a U.S. president is tantamount to a civil war. So on the one hand, I would say these are a bit sensationalist, but on the other hand, we do have to look at the facts and the statements coming out of these groups who are actively calling for a civil war. So on the other hand, you are correct. I think we might be at a pivotal moment in U.S. history.
Maria, final word before I let both of you go. Do you think we are heading to a civil war? Do you think it is, as Jeffrey there said, that the U.S. is stronger than this? I mean, of course, I don't want to generalize and be sensationalist, but there's a lot of worry, right, about the kind of polarization that we've seen, not just during the Trump presidency. I mean, if we're completely honest, we did see a lot of polarization even during the Obama years.
Well, I think historically there have been periods where there have been social unrest and social movements, and this is probably one of the highest points in this the recent 10 to 20 years. But there's also other data that we could look at. For example, since the pandemic and the lockdown started, there have been some increases in the sales of weapons. Also, there are some numbers polling people's attitudes towards violence as a resource, a tool that we'd use in a situation like where they feel threatened. So those numbers, the polling and the numbers about the gun sales, it tells us how society in general, without going into details, society in general is feeling some sort of unease. But I'm not sure that's enough for us to call it as an indicator of civil war. It's just, I think, a cultural change. There is a cultural change, and it's getting all mixed up with this, of course, the effects of that change in the demographics. That's my take at it. But I'm not sure I would go as far as to say that this is where it's heading to. I guess you would need a lot more of data and polling regarding people's attitude.
All right, we'll have to leave there as a word as the clock has gotten the best of us. We do sincerely appreciate both Maria and Jeffrey for their time this morning out of their busy schedules, of course, to share their thoughts with us. It's interesting when you're looking at these sort of militant groups in the United States because domestic terrorism and domestic militancy, as Jeffrey had alluded to and Maria had alluded to, is not something new in the United States. And Jeffrey had laid out for us what happened in the 90s, and especially, of course, with the Oklahoma City bombing. We all remember that, and the implications of that at that time when it came to white supremacist, white nationalist, however we want to term it, groups. But at this point, with a president like Donald Trump, who initially in that debate, remember, didn't even condemn white supremacy in that first debate that he had, then later on he did go on to say that he would condemn and did condemn white supremacist groups and their violence. Nevertheless, has he played into the hands of these groups? Is he in some ways giving them encouragement about a possible quote-unquote civil war around the elections or because of the elections or even after for other reasons? Especially, remember, the Black Lives Matter movement has really created a lot of controversy around these opposing groups at this point in time as well. Of course, a wait-and-see game for all of us, both in the United States and around the world. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.